The fog came first, before the light did, drifting soft and grey through the harbour at Plymouth in the early summer of 1609. It moved low along the water, curling around the hulls of ships that sat still and patient at anchor, their masts rising up into a sky that had not yet decided whether it would be blue or simply pale. There was no wind yet to speak of. The air held that particular stillness that belongs only to harbours before dawn, when the work of the night has ended and the work of the day has not yet begun, when the creak of rope and timber sounds louder than it should, and every footstep on the wooden quay seems to carry further than it has any right to. 9 ships waited in that fog. Their masts, dozens of them, rose like a bare winter forest above the water, silent, black against the lightening sky. Somewhere among the hulls, a bell rang once, dull and flat in the mist, and was not answered. Lanterns still burned on a few decks, their light thin and yellow, doing little more than marking the presence of the ships, rather than illuminating them. To anyone watching from the shore, and there would have been a few fishermen mostly, a handful of dock workers already awake, the fleet must have looked less like a beginning and more like a fleet already drowned, waiting only for the tide to claim it. But it was a beginning. It was, in fact, one of the largest and most ambitious beginnings that England had yet attempted to send across the Atlantic, and the fog that hid it that morning would prove in time to be a fitting overture for everything that followed. To understand why 9 ships sat crowded into Plymouth Harbour that June, heavy with people and provisions, and the particular anxious hope of investors who had already lost a great deal of money, one must understand what England had already tried and what England had already lost. 2 years before, in the spring of 1607, a small company of colonists had crossed the ocean and built a settlement they called Jamestown on a marshy stretch of land beside a river in Virginia. It had been the first permanent English colony in the New World, and it had very nearly failed within its first year. The soil was poor, the water brackish, the summers thick with fever, and the relationship between the colonists and the Powhatan peoples who already lived on that land was fragile at best, violent at worst. Of the men who had first landed, more than half were dead within 8 months. Letters home spoke of starvation, of disease, of a colony hanging by a single thread of resupply from across an ocean that took months to cross in either direction. The men who had invested in this venture, the shareholders of the Virginia Company of London, were not soldiers or sailors. They were merchants, gentlemen, men of business who had put their money into the idea of Virginia the way one might put money into a promising ship or a foreign trade route, expecting profit, expecting gold or silk or some undiscovered wealth to justify the expense. Instead, they had received only reports of graves, and yet they did not withdraw. If anything, the failures of the first years hardened their resolve, because too much had already been spent to simply let the colony collapse. There is a particular kind of desperation that settles over an investment once it has already cost more than anyone intended, and by 1609, the Virginia Company was deep within that desperation. Their answer was to try again, but larger. This time, they would not send a handful of ships with 100 settlers. They would send an entire fleet, 9 vessels in total, carrying perhaps 600 people, sailors and soldiers and colonists and craftsmen, along with the food, tools, and livestock the earlier expeditions had so badly lacked. This was to be called the third supply, and it was meant to end, once and for all, the danger that Jamestown might simply starve itself into extinction. It carried with it not just goods, but a new charter, granting the colony a more centralized government and a new deputy governor, a man named Thomas Gates, who would take command of Virginia and impose order upon a settlement that had, by every account reaching London, fallen into quarreling and near ruin. It was an age that trusted almost everything to the wind and the discipline of wood and rope. There was no faster way to cross an ocean than the way the Sea Venture and her sister ships would cross it. No faster way to send word home than to place a letter in a ship's hold and pray for a safe return voyage. England's foothold in the New World was, in the truest sense, a gamble laid upon the sea itself. A wager that ships built by hand and read by the stars could carry ambition across 3,000 miles of open water and land it, intact, upon a shore that offered no guarantee of welcome. Every man who invested in the Virginia Company understood, at some level, that he was gambling not merely money, but time, patience, and the uncertain mercy of weather. At the center of this fleet, the ship meant to carry its authority, as well as its hope, was a vessel newly built for this very voyage. She was called the Sea Venture, and she had been constructed specifically to serve as the flagship of the third supply, her timbers still fresh with the scent of pine and pitch, her decks not yet worn smooth by years of use. She was, by the measure of her time, an imposing vessel, broad in the beam, capable of carrying both cargo and a substantial number of passengers, built with the kind of careful attention given to ships, meant to represent something more than trade. She was not old. She had not yet been tested by a true Atlantic crossing, had not yet learned, in the way that ships seem to learn, the particular temperament of the ocean she was about to enter. Her maiden voyage, in fact, was to be this one, the crossing to Virginia, the delivery of a new governor, a new hope to a colony teetering on collapse. Command of the Sea Venture, and indeed of the entire fleet, was placed in the hands of two men whose names carried weight in England's maritime circles. Sir George Somers held the rank of admiral, a veteran of English naval service and privateering, a man whose reputation had been built on decades at sea, weathered by storms and battles both. Somers was not young. He had seen enough of the ocean's moods to respect them without fear, the kind of quiet, practiced confidence that comes only from having survived what others had not. Beside him sailed Captain Christopher Newport, who had already crossed to Virginia several times before, a man intimately familiar with the route, the currents, the long stretches of empty water between England and the New World. Newport had captained the very first voyage that founded Jamestown 2 years prior. Between the two of them, Somers and Newport represented the very best experience England could offer a colony that could not afford another failure. Their presence aboard the Sea Venture was meant as a kind of assurance that whatever storms or delays might come, these were men equal to the task of bringing the fleet safely home. Aboard the Sea Venture too travelled Sir Thomas Gates, the newly appointed deputy governor, carrying with him the sealed charter that would reorganize the colony's government, along with a great number of colonists, craftsmen, servants, and gentlemen adventurers drawn by the promise, however distant. The distlue of land and opportunity in a place most of them had never seen and could barely imagine. Among these passengers was a young man named William Strachey, a writer by temperament, if not yet by profession, a man who had dabbled in London's literary circles before financial troubles pushed him toward the more practical, if uncertain prospect of the New World. Strachey could not have known, standing on that deck in the early fog, that his pen would one day carry the story of this voyage further than any ship ever could, that his account of what was to come would find its way into the hands of playwrights and poets, would shake the imagination of an England that had never crossed the ocean at all. He was that morning simply another passenger among hundreds, watching the same grey mist the others watched, feeling perhaps the same uncertain mixture of excitement and dread that accompanies any departure into the unknown. The morning wore on slowly, as such mornings do. Provisions were checked and rechecked, final letters written and sent ashore with the last boats. prayers spoken quietly by ministers moving from ship to ship, blessing the voyage in the manner of the age, solemn, unhurried, entrusting the fleet to a providence that was assumed rather than guaranteed. Livestock load somewhere below decks, unsettled by the motion of loading. Sailors called to one another across the water in the particular shorthand of men who had done this work many times before, checking, rigging, securing cargo, preparing the great sails that would soon catch what wind the day offered. And then, as the fog began at last to thin under the strengthening light, the 9 ships of the third supply began, one by one, to slip their moorings. There was no great fanfare, no crowd cheering from the docks in the way later ages might imagine such departures. There was only the quiet, practiced work of leaving, ropes drawn in, sails rising slowly up their masts, the gentle groan of timber taking the first pull of open water. The Sea Venture led them, her fresh timbers catching the early light as she turned her bow toward the harbour mouth, and, beyond it, the vast grey expanse of the Atlantic. Behind her came the rest of the fleet, 8 ships trailing in her wake, carrying between them the hopes of a company, the ambitions of a nation, and the futures of hundreds of men, women and children who had chosen, or been chosen, to risk everything on a crossing whose outcome none of them could yet foresee. The fog lifted fully as they passed beyond the breakwater, revealing at last a clear line where sea met sky, and toward that line, slowly, steadily, the 9 ships began to sail. For the first days, the fleet held together with a discipline that pleased even the most anxious of the merchants who had invested their fortunes in the voyage. The Sea Venture led, as was fitting for the vessel that carried the expedition's governor and the weight of its authority, and behind her the other 8 ships kept their positions, with the careful patience of animals grazing in a loose herd, never straying far, never crowding close. Admiral Somers, aboard his own vessel, could look back across the water on a clear morning and count them all, sails catching the same wind, hulls rising and falling on the same long swells, and feel for a moment that the ocean itself had agreed to be generous. The winds that carried them south and west in those early days were steady in a way that sailors spoke of with quiet gratitude, not trusting good fortune enough to name it aloud for fear of inviting its opposite. The rigging, still new on the Sea Venture, had not yet learned the give and take of long strain, and it announced itself constantly, creaking and settling with each shift of the ship's weight against the water. Below decks, men who had sailed old vessels for years found the sound almost unfamiliar, a young ship's voice still finding its register, still working out where it would groan and where it would hold silent. Some found the sound reassuring, evidence of strength not yet tested. Others found it difficult to sleep against, a constant reminder that they rode inside a structure of rope and timber that had never yet been asked what it could truly bear. The rhythm of the days established itself quickly, the way it does aboard any vessel where hundreds of lives must be arranged into some semblance of order. The colonists, unused to the sea, learned within the first week which hours brought relief from nausea and which brought its return, learned to move with the roll of the deck rather than against it, learned the peculiar economy of space that shipboard life demanded, where a trunk became a table, a coiled rope became a seat, and privacy became a memory of the life left behind rather than a feature of the life now being lived. Meals came at fixed hours and in fixed portions, salted meat and hard biscuit, and small measures of beer. The taste of all of it growing less distinct as the days passed, and the same flavors repeated themselves with the ship's own monotony. Water was rationed with a care that bordered on reverence, each cask marked and counted, because water, more than food, more than gold, was what would determine how far they could travel before the ocean's indifference became a danger rather than merely a discomfort. Among the passengers were men whose names would later matter to history in ways they could not have anticipated at the time. William Strachey among them, a man given to observation and to writing down what he observed. Though on those early days, his notes concerned themselves mostly with the ordinary matters of the voyage rather than the extraordinary ones that would come later. He wrote, in the unhurried hand of a man with time to fill, of the fleet's good order, of the admiral's competence, of the mood aboard the Sea Venture, which he described as cautiously hopeful, the passengers settling into their new circumstance with the resignation of people who had already made their decision and now simply awaited its consequences. Below the deck of hopeful description, though, ran a current of daily hardship that Strachey's early entries touched only lightly. The cramped quarters where families slept in shifts, where children who had never seen the ocean before now lived entirely surrounded by it, where the smell of unwashed bodies mixed with salt air and tar and the faint sourness of provisions beginning, even this early, to show the first signs of the long voyage's toll. Sickness moved through certain corners of the ship in the way it does when populations are pressed close together. Not the deadly fevers that would come to define later voyages to Virginia, but the smaller miseries, the coughs, the fluxes, the general malaise that came from bad air and salt water. And yet amid this discomfort, there was hope, threading through the ship's population like a second current running counter to the physical hardship. Many aboard the Sea Venture had left behind lives that offered little promise, debts unpaid, prospects narrow, futures that seemed already written before they had properly begun. Virginia, for all its uncertainty, represented the possibility of a different story. Land to be had, position to be earned, a colony still young enough that a determined man or woman might rise within it in ways the rigid structures of England. Letters were written in these early days, though none aboard the Sea Venture yet knew how long it would be before those letters found their way to hands waiting in England, if they ever did at all. Fathers wrote to children left in the care of grandparents, describing the ship, the sea, the strange food, promising land and houses, and a life better than the one they had known, writing with a particular optimism of people who have not yet been tested by the thing they are describing. Wives wrote to husbands who had stayed behind to settle affairs and would follow on later ships, describing their fear and their determination in the same sentence, unwilling to admit one without the other. Governor Gates, aboard the Sea Venture, in his capacity as the colony's new authority, occupied himself with the administrative weight of what awaited him in Jamestown. The reports of hardship that had reached England, describing a settlement barely surviving, its population reduced by disease and starvation and conflict with the people whose land they had claimed as their own. He carried with him instructions meant to reform the colony's governance, to impose the kind of order that its founders believed had been lacking. And in the quiet hours of the crossing, he reviewed these instructions with the seriousness of a man who understood that failure in Virginia, perhaps permanently, England's ambitions in that part of the world. It was somewhere in the second week, by the reckoning later pieced together from the accounts of those who survived to record them, that the first subtle signs began to register, not as alarm, not yet, but as small observations murmured between men whose trade was reading the sky and the water for what they could not yet see with their eyes. The clouds, which had held a certain familiar architecture through the early days of fair weather, began to take on formations that the more experienced sailors recognized without being able to name precisely what they recognized in them, a certain heaviness at the horizon's edge, a stacking of vapor that suggested weight and intention, rather than the loose drift of ordinary cloud. There was, too, a stillness that some aboard remarked upon, a quality in the air that felt less like calm and more like a held breath. The wind that had carried them so steadily began in small and almost imperceptible ways to shift in its character, not dying, not yet, but losing some quality of consistency that had marked it before, gusting oddly. backing and filling in ways that made the sailors exchange glances, even as they said nothing to the passengers, who could not have read the signs, even if they had been told of them directly. Among the crew, murmurs began the way they always do, aboard ships approaching weather that instinct recognizes before instrument or observation can confirm it. Old hands who had crossed this ocean before spoke quietly of the season, of how late in the year the fleet had departed, of how the waters this far from England and this far into summer's decline had a history of producing storms that came from nowhere and grew with a speed that left little time for preparation. These conversations happened in the low-toned sailors use when they do not wish to alarm those who depend on them for reassurance, happening near the helm, near the rigging, in the brief moments between duties when men who understood the sea could speak to one another without an audience of frightened passengers. The colonists, for their part, noticed little of this undercurrent. Absorbed as they were in their own private preoccupations, their letters, their prayers, their small routines of endurance, some among them noted only that the days had grown warmer in a way that felt oppressive rather than pleasant, that the ordinary business of moving about the deck had become somehow more tiring, that sleep came less easily despite the body's exhaustion. A few of the more devout among them increased their prayers in these days, not from any specific fear, but from the general practice of turning to faith when the unfamiliar pressed too closely, and their prayers, recorded later by those who remembered them, spoke mostly of safe passage and swift arrival, rather than of any particular danger they could name. By the later days of July, the sky above the fleet had begun to take on colors that even the least experienced eye could recognize as unusual, a strange deepening at the horizon during hours when the light should have remained clear, a coppery quality to certain sunsets that the ship's chaplain, in a private note, described as beautiful in a way that troubled him more than it pleased him. The sea beneath the ships, too, had begun its slow transformation, swells growing longer, their rhythm less predictable, the surface catching wind in patterns that seemed to shift direction without clear cause. As the 9 ships still sailed together, still held their formation across the wide grey water, but those who watched the horizon with the trained attention of men whose lives depended on such watching had begun, by these final days of ease, to sense that somewhere beyond the edge of what they could see, something vast was gathering itself. Indifferent to the hopes carried aboard the ships below it, indifferent to the letters written below decks, indifferent to the governor's instructions and the admiral's careful navigation, waiting only for its moment to arrive. The moment arrived on the 24th of July, though no man aboard could have named the precise hour when the change began, for the sea does not announce its intentions with the courtesy of a herald. It arrives instead in increments so small that a sailor's mind resists naming them as warnings until warning has become inadequate to the word. The sky, which had held its pale blue color for so many mornings that the eye had grown accustomed to trusting it, began to thicken along the western edge with a haze that was not quite cloud and not quite mist, but some third thing that experienced men recognized without being able to explain how they recognized it: tow. The light took on a strange quality in the hours before noon, a kind of yellow dimness that made the water look older than it had looked the day before, as though the sea itself had aged overnight, and now wore the color of tarnished brass rather than the clean gray it had shown for weeks. The barometric instruments carried aboard the Sea Venture, crude by the measure of later centuries, but sufficient to the trained eye of an experienced sailing master, began their slow decline sometime in the early afternoon. This was not knowledge available to every man aboard, for such instruments were tended by officers and read according to a private language of pressure and inference that ordinary sailors were not always privy to, but the effects of that falling pressure needed no instrument to be felt. The air itself seemed to thicken, taking on a weight that pressed against the chest in a manner difficult to describe and impossible to ignore. Men who had sailed for 20 years found themselves glancing at the horizon more often than their duties required, not because any single sight demanded their attention, but because some older instinct, older than instrument and older than training, had begun to whisper that the day was not behaving as days were meant to behave. The wind was the first plain evidence that something had shifted in the world beyond denial. It had blown steadily from the southwest for the better part of the crossing, a companionable wind that filled the sails without demanding excessive labor from the men who tended them. But now it began to swing, first to the south, then further, circling with a restlessness that seemed almost deliberate, as though searching for the direction from which it meant to strike in earnest. By late afternoon, it had found new strength, no longer a breeze that could be described in the gentle vocabulary of fair weather, but a force that pushed against rigging and canvas with an insistence that made the ship groan in ways she had not groaned before. The sailors, who had spent the crossing in relative ease, now moved with a different quality of attention, their conversations growing shorter, their eyes lifting more frequently toward the darkening sky, their hands finding excuses to check knots and lines that had been secure for weeks, but which now seemed in this changed air to deserve a second inspection. Sir George Somers, Admiral of the Fleet and Master of the Sea Venture, in all but formal title, was among the first to recognize what was gathering, for he had crossed enough waters in his long life to know the particular quality of dread that accompanies a true storm, rather than the passing squalls that sailors learn to shrug aside. He gave his orders with the calm precision of a man who had faced such moments before, calling for sail to be reduced, for loose gear to be secured, for the ship's company to prepare itself not for discomfort, but for genuine trial. The other ships of the fleet, still visible in the thickening light, seemed to sense the same gathering wrongness, for signal flags were raised and acknowledged, and the formation drew tighter as though proximity to one another might offer some protection against what none of them could yet see. By evening the transformation was complete, in all but its final violence. The sky had darkened, not with the gentle fading of ordinary dusk, but with a bruised and swollen quality. Clouds piling upon clouds in shades of grey and green that seemed unnatural even to men who had watched 1,000 sunsets from 1,000 decks. The sea beneath this darkening sky had begun to rise in swells far larger than any the fleet had encountered in the calm weeks before, long rolling hills of water that lifted the Sea Venture and let her fall again with a rhythm that had ceased to be pleasant and had become instead a kind of grim rehearsal for what was still to come. The wind's pitch rose alongside the waves, no longer merely loud, but beginning to take on a voice, a high, thin whistling through the rigging that would, in the hours ahead, deepen into something closer to a scream. The storm proper announced itself sometime after dark, though darkness had already made the world so black that the ship's company could measure the storm's arrival only by feeling rather than sight. The wind, which had been rising steadily through the evening, now leapt forward with a violence that seemed to erase the memory of every gentler gust that had preceded it. It came not as a single blow, but as a sustained assault, howling through the shrouds with a pitch that climbed ever higher until the very air seemed to shriek with a voice too vast for any single throat to have produced. The waves grew correspondingly monstrous, no longer the long rolling swells of early evening, but sudden towering walls of black water that rose without warning and broke over the ship's rails with a force that sent men sprawling across the deck, clutching at whatever rope or rail came within reach of their grasping hands. The timbers of the Sea Venture, sound and well-built as she was, began to groan beneath this assault in a manner that every sailor aboard recognized as more than the ordinary complaint of wood flexing against water. This was a deeper protest, a sound that seemed to rise from the ship's very structure, as though the vessel herself understood the magnitude of what she now faced and voiced, her understanding in long, low moans that carried even above the shriek of wind and the crash of wave. Men below decks, huddled in whatever shelter the ship's interior could offer, felt these groans transmitted through the hull itself, a vibration as much as a sound, and those among them who had crossed oceans before exchanged glances that needed no words. For they understood that the ship spoke a language of distress that experienced ears could translate without difficulty. It was somewhere in these early hours of true storm that visibility collapsed entirely, and with it, the fleet's careful formation dissolved into chaos. The rain had begun as a heavy but ordinary downpour, the kind that any crossing might expect during a summer squall, but it thickened rapidly into something closer to a solid wall of water, driven nearly horizontal by the howling wind until sea and sky seemed to merge into a single grey violence with no clear boundary between the two. Spray torn from the wave crests joined this deluge, filling the air with a stinging mist that made breathing difficult and seeing nearly impossible beyond the length of an outstretched arm. The lanterns that might have offered some small comfort of light were extinguished almost as soon as they were lit, snuffed by wind or spray before their glow could offer any man his bearings. In this collapsing visibility, the other 8 ships of the fleet vanished one by one, swallowed into the storm's grey throat, until the Sea Venture found herself entirely alone upon a sea that had become, in the space of a few hours, an enemy without mercy or reason. Signal lanterns that had allowed the ships to track one another through the gathering dusk were now useless, for no light could penetrate the driving rain and flying spray, and even had such light been visible, no lookout could have held his position long enough at the rail to search for it, without risking his life to the waves that broke continuously across the deck. The Admiral's flagship, once surrounded by the comforting presence of her sister vessels, now rode alone through mountains of black water, cut off from any possibility of aid or rescue, dependent entirely upon her own construction and the skill of the men who crewed her. The sailors who fought to keep the ship alive through these hours labored with an exhaustion that deepened by the minute, for the storm showed no sign of relenting and offered no pause in which weary muscles might recover their strength. Men hauled at lines with hands blistered and bleeding, their grip made treacherous by the constant wet, and more than once a sailor lost his footing on the pitching deck, only to be caught, barely, by a companion's desperate grasp before the sea could claim him. The officers shouted their orders into the howling wind, but so fierce was the storm's voice that commands were torn from their mouths and scattered before they could reach the ears they were intended for. So that much of the ship's defense proceeded not through clear direction, but through the trained instinct of men who had weathered storms before and understood, without needing to be told, what task required their hands next. It was in the deepest hours of this struggle, when the ship had been beaten by wind and wave for so long that the company's strength had begun to fray at its edges, that the first serious damage revealed itself. A seam along the hull, strained beyond what its caulking could bear, began to open beneath the relentless pressure of the sea, and water that had, until now, been kept properly outside the vessel, began instead to seep into the darkness of the hold. It came slowly at first, a trickle rather than a flood, easy enough to overlook amid the general chaos of wind and spray and shouted orders, but those who discovered it understood immediately what it portended. The ship that had carried them so faithfully across weeks of gentler water had begun, in this her hour of true trial, to fail beneath them, and the long night that lay still ahead would demand of every man aboard a labor more desperate than any they had yet performed. That first trickle became, within the hour, something the crew could no longer pretend to ignore. Sir George Somers, standing at the helm with the wind tearing at his cloak and the rain running in sheets from the brim of his hat, gave the order that would define the days to come. The pumps were to be manned without ceasing. Every soul aboard, capable of lifting a bucket or working a handle, was to be called to the labor. And no one, not gentleman nor sailor, not passenger nor officer, would be permitted the luxury of standing apart from the effort. The sea did not recognize rank, and in the hours that followed, neither did the Sea Venture. The ship's pumps, built for the ordinary business of clearing bilge water accumulated through weeks of travel, had never been designed for what was now demanded of them. Water entered through the strained seams of the hull faster than the mechanisms could expel it, and so the crew turned to older, cruder method. Buckets were passed hand to hand in long human chains that stretched from the flooding hold-up through the hatches to the deck, where the contents were flung over the rail into a sea already indifferent to the addition. Men worked until their arms would no longer answer them, then stepped aside for others to take their place, then returned again when their brief respite had done what little good it could. There was no true rest to be had, only rotation, only the endless passing of vessels, filled and emptied and filled again. William Strachey, who would later set down the fullest account of what transpired during those 3 days, wrote of a labor so unrelenting that men began to lose the ordinary sense of time passing, each hour indistinguishable from the one before it, marked only by the changing of hands at the pumps. Creeping rise of water that no effort seemed capable of holding back. He described the ship groaning beneath the strain, her timbers working against each other with a sound he likened to the complaints of some great creature in pain. And he wrote, with the particular care of a man determined that posterity should understand what had been endured, that the storm seemed to have singled out this one vessel for a trial beyond what any company of ordinary men might reasonably survive. The passengers, many of whom had boarded the Sea Venture with no experience of the sea beyond what the voyage itself had taught them, found themselves thrust into labor they could scarcely have imagined when they left the calm streets of London or the harbour at Plymouth. Merchants who had never lifted anything heavier than a ledger now hauled buckets alongside sailors twice their strength. Women too took their place in the chains, for the danger admitted no distinction between the labour fit for men and the labour fit for women, and those who might otherwise have remained below to tend the sick or comfort the frightened found themselves instead standing knee-deep in rising water. Taus passing, vessels upward into the dark, with hands that blistered and bled from the unfamiliar rope and wood. Strachey would later write that the women aboard bore themselves with a steadiness that shamed those who might have expected otherwise, working through the night without complaint, pausing only when their strength gave entirely out and returning again as soon as it had partially recovered. He recorded, too, the particular horror of children caught within this struggle, too young to labor themselves, but old enough to understand in some dim and terrible way that the adults around them were fighting for their lives, and that the outcome of this fight remained entirely uncertain. Through the first day, the company held their own against the water, though only barely, and only through labor that left every man and woman aboard trembling with exhaustion by the time darkness fell. The storm showed no sign of relenting. If anything, the wind seemed to gather fresh strength as the hours passed, as though the tempest that had found them somewhere between the Azores and the Virginia coast had determined that one day's fury was insufficient to the purpose it intended. The Sea Venture rode the mountainous seas as best her battered frame allowed, climbing each towering wave only to plunge into the trough beyond with a force that drove seawater through every seam not already opened by the storm's earlier violence. By the second day, the water in the hold had risen past what any reasonable calculation would have thought survivable, and still it continued to rise. The pumps, manned in shifts that grew shorter as exhaustion mounted, could do no more than slow the flooding rather than halt it. Strachey wrote of casks of provisions floating loose within the hold of the ship's stores, ruined by the rising water, of the particular despair that settled over men who understood that even should they somehow survive the storm itself, they might yet starve before reaching any shore capable of relieving them. He wrote, too, of prayer offered not as ceremony, but as genuine and desperate petition. Ministers among the passengers leading such devotions as the chaos permitted, their voices lost half the time beneath the shrieking of the wind, and yet continued nonetheless, for what else remained to men who had exhausted every practical measure available to them? It was during these hours that something like a quiet resignation began to settle over portions of the company. Not despair, exactly. For despair implies a surrender of effort that these people did not make, but rather a settling of the spirit into acceptance of whatever outcome Providence intended. Strachey described passengers who ceased their labor, not from any failure of will, but because their bodies had simply reached the limit of what flesh could accomplish, and who then knelt where they stood, amid the rising water and the shrieking wind, and commended themselves to whatever mercy might yet be shown them. There was, in his account, no shame attached to this resignation. It was understood by all present as the natural response of mortal creatures brought at last to the edge of their endurance, and those who continued to labor did not judge those who could labor no more. And yet, even amid this quiet surrender, the greater portion of the company continued their desperate work, driven perhaps less by hope of success than by the simple human refusal to cease struggling while breath remained. The bucket chains continued their grim procession from hold to deck to sea. The pumps continued their futile churning. And at the helm, through all of this, Sir George Somers remained. It was Somers, above all, whom Strachey credited with such order as the ship maintained during these terrible hours. The Admiral, well past the years when most men would have surrendered such physical trial to younger officers, stood his post at the helm with a composure that seemed to those who observed it almost beyond the natural. He did not shout unnecessarily. He did not permit his own evident exhaustion to communicate itself as panic to those around him. Rather, he issued his orders in the same steady voice he might have used to direct the loading of cargo on some ordinary morning in an English port. And this steadiness, more than any single tactical decision he made, held the crew together through hours when panic would have served them far worse than calm. Strachey recorded that Somers remained at the helm for the better part of the entire ordeal, refusing relief even when it was offered, sustained by what reserves of strength or will his younger companions could not entirely account for. It was said afterward, and Strachey included the report in his own account, that it was Somers who first sighted a strange glow playing about the ship's masts and rigging during the darkest hour of the storm, a phenomenon the sailors knew by the name of St. Elmo's fire, and that this eerie light, rather than causing alarm, seemed almost to steady the company further, understood by the more experienced hands as a sign, not of doom, but of the storm's electrical violence passing through its most dangerous phase. Whether this interpretation was accurate or merely a comfort seized upon by frightened men, it did seem that the light's appearance coincided with no worsening of their fortune, and some among the company took what hope they could from its passing. But hope, however gathered, could not alter the plain arithmetic of water entering a hull faster than it could be removed. By the third day, the situation had become, in Strachey's own careful words, past all hope of recovery through ordinary means. The water in the hold had risen to a depth that made the pump's continued operation almost meaningless, a gesture towards salvation rather than any genuine prospect of it. The decks themselves had begun to take water with each wave that broke over the rail, and below decks the passengers, who could no longer assist in the bailing, found themselves standing in water that rose steadily past their ankles, then their knees, with no indication that its rise would cease before it claimed the ship entire. It was at this point with a vessel so heavily laden with seawater that she rode low and sluggish even in the troughs between waves, that the company began, without any formal order or announcement, to prepare themselves for the ship's foundering. Some among the passengers gathered what few possessions remained dry and portable, though what use such possessions might serve upon a sinking ship in the midst of the open Atlantic, none could readily say. Others simply ceased their labor and gathered with their families, husbands and wives and children, drawing close together in whatever dry corner of the vessel yet remained, understanding that whatever hours or minutes yet remained to them were better spent in each other's company than in a struggle that had, by every practical measure, already been lost. Raki himself, in the account he would later compose, confessed that he had by this hour abandoned any expectation of seeing land again, and had turned his thoughts instead toward the preparation of his soul for whatever awaited beyond this life. The ship groaned beneath them, low in the water now, her decks awash with the same sea that had carried her so many weeks toward a destination she seemed destined never to reach, and still the storm raged on, indifferent to the small human drama unfolding within the wooden hull it battered, giving no sign whatsoever that its fury might yet relent before the Sea Venture slipped beneath the waves entirely. It was in the 4th hour past midnight, when the rain had begun at last to thin from a solid grey wall into something more like a curtain of falling threads, that a sailor stationed near the bow, his eyes long since raw from salt and wind, called out in a voice that cracked with disbelief rather than triumph. He had seen, he said, a darker shape against the darkness, not the rolling black of wave against wave, but something fixed, something that did not move with the water's own restless rhythm. No one aboard dared to hope aloud that this might be land, for they had learned across these last 3 days that hope offered too soon was only another kind of cruelty. But Newport turned the ship's head toward that shape all the same, and Summers, still lashed to his place above, strained his salt-blind eyes toward it until the shape resolved itself, slowly into something that could only be a coastline, low and dark against a sky beginning, almost imperceptibly, to lighten toward dawn. It should have been a moment of pure relief. Land after so long a fear of the sea's final claim, and for a heartbeat it was. Men who had not permitted themselves to weep through 3 days of bailing and praying now found tears mixing freely with the rain on their faces, and someone below began, without any evident decision, to do so. A low murmur of thanksgiving that spread quietly through the hold, but the relief did not last, for word passed quickly among those who had sailed these waters before, or who had heard the tales told in the taverns of Plymouth and the counting-houses of London, that this coastline, this low, dark shape rising from the grey Atlantic dawn, Bermuda. The island sailors had learned across 100 years of report and rumour to avoid, as they might avoid a plague ship, a place spoken of, not as a haven, but as a hazard, ringed by reefs, said to have claimed vessel after vessel in silence, its waters populated, in the telling of frightened men, by devils and spirits, and a malevolence that seemed to rise from the rock itself. The Spanish, who had charted much of this ocean in their long century of dominance, had marked these islands on their maps with warnings rather than welcomes, noting them as a place to be given wide berth, their harbours treacherous, their reefs unpredictable and jagged beneath waters that, from a passing ship's deck, looked deceptively calm. No colony had ever been planted there. No safe harbour had ever been charted with confidence. The tales that reached English ears spoke of strange cries carried on the wind at night, of ships that approached too close and were never seen again, of a general and settled conviction among mariners that this small ring of islands, alone among all the Atlantic's scattered lands, was a place that did not want to be found, and did not welcome those who found it regardless. The Isle of Devils, men called it, and they said the name with the particular seriousness sailors reserve for warnings passed down from those who did not survive to give further warning. It was toward this place, this reputation, this ring of half-legendary danger, that the shattered Sea Venture now drifted low in the water, her decks awash, her company exhausted past the point of ordinary fear and arrived at some calmer, stranger country of feeling beyond it. Whatever Bermuda's reputation, the ship could not now avoid her. 3 days of storm had left the Sea Venture with no capacity for evasion, no reserve of strength for altering course towards safer waters, if such waters even existed within reach. The Isle of Devils, real or imagined, dangerous or merely maligned by sailors' superstition, was what the sea had brought them to, and there was no longer any question of choosing otherwise. What happened next would be remembered by those who survived to remember it as the finest hour of Christopher Newport's long career at sea and of George Somers' particular gift for reading water that other men saw only as chaos. For as the light grew and the coastline resolved itself further into visibility, low hills, a fringe of pale sand, and beyond it all, unmistakably the white lines of surf, breaking over rock that lay just beneath the surface in a manner no chart aboard the ship had ever recorded, it became clear to every experienced eye on deck that the greater danger was no longer the storm itself, but the reef that guarded this shore, a barrier of coral and stone that had, by every account ever given of these waters, torn apart vessel after vessel that approached too carelessly. Somers took the ship's direction himself in these final hours, calling adjustments to the helm with a steadiness that seemed, to the exhausted men around him, almost unnatural given how little sleep or rest he had permitted himself across the preceding days. He had spent much of the storm lashed to his post precisely so that his judgment might remain available in a moment such as this, and now that moment had come. He watched the pattern of the surf, the places where the white water broke high and violent against submerged rock, and the places where, by some subtler variance in color and texture, the water suggested a channel, a way through where the reef's teeth might be narrower or set at a more forgiving depth. He called his corrections in a voice pitched to carry over the wind's last dying gusts, and Newport, at the helm, answered each command with the same wordless precision that had marked their partnership across so many years of shared voyaging. The Sea Venture came toward the reef, not blind, but threaded Somers, guiding her through gaps that another captain, less patient or less practiced, might never have discerned in time. Twice the ship's hull scraped against something beneath the surface, a grinding shudder that ran through every timber and every man who felt it, and twice the vessel shuddered free and continued on, still afloat, still following the narrow path Somers had found within the white chaos of breaking water. It was, those aboard would later agree, less a passage than a threading of a needle performed at the scale of a full-rigged ship. Every foot of clearance measured not in careful daylight calculation, but in the desperate, practiced instinct of a man who had spent a lifetime learning to read what the sea concealed. And then, at last, with the shore now near enough that individual trees could be distinguished along its low ridgeline, the reef claimed the ship after all, not violently, not in the manner of the wrecks whose stories had built Bermuda's fearful reputation, but with a kind of deliberate, almost gentle finality. Somers, seeing that further threading was no longer possible, that the ship's remaining strength would not carry her clear of the last barrier between the open water and the shore, made the choice that would define the whole of what followed, rather than allow the Sea Venture to founder in open water beyond the reef, or to be torn apart by rocks approached at an unfortunate angle. He directed Newport to drive her forward, deliberately, onto the reef itself, wedging her fast between two great outcroppings of coral rock in a manner that held her upright, held her steady, held her, remarkably, from the swift disintegration that reef-wrecked ships so commonly suffered. The Sea Venture came to rest there, caught and held nearly a mile from the shore she had so nearly failed to reach, her hull grinding once, twice, against the unyielding rock beneath her, and then settling into a stillness that felt, after 3 days of ceaseless violent motion, almost holy in its suddenness. The storm, as if satisfied that its work here was complete, began at last to ease. The wind that had screamed without pause for 3 full days softened gust by gust into something merely strong and then merely brisk, and the rain thinned further still until it became possible to see clearly in the grey light of that 4th morning, and exactly how narrow the margin had been between this outcome and a far darker one. What followed, in the hours immediately after, was a slow and disbelieving accounting. Every soul who had boarded the Sea Venture in Plymouth Harbour those long weeks before was found, upon careful reckoning, to still be alive. Not one man, woman, or child had been lost in 3 days of storm, violent enough that every account agreed no ship should reasonably have survived it, and none had been lost in this final desperate passage through a reef whose reputation had been built on the bones of vessels far less fortunate. The ship that had seemed, hour upon hour, to be their doom, the leaking hull, the failing pumps, the water rising past hope of bailing, had become, in this last strange turn, their salvation, wedged fast upon rock in a manner that held her steady enough to serve for the hours and days immediately following. As something between a shelter and a bridge, between the ruin of the voyage and whatever waited on the shore beyond. They came ashore slowly, in the ship's boats ferried across that mile of shallow water in relays through the remainder of that grey morning. Men first, to test the footing and assess what manner of place had received them. Then women. Then whatever provisions and possessions could be gathered from a vessel no one yet dared trust to hold together indefinitely upon her rocky perch. The company that stumbled onto that unfamiliar sand did so with the particular exhaustion of those who have spent 3 days believing themselves already lost, now confronted with the strange, almost unbearable weight of survival instead. They did not know, as their feet first pressed into soft ground that did not roll or pitch beneath them, what manner of island this truly was, whether the old sailors' tales of devils and cries in the night held any grain of truth, or whether Bermuda's fearsome reputation was simply the accumulated fright of men who had never dared linger long enough to learn otherwise. They knew only that they had been delivered, against every reasonable expectation, onto solid ground, and that whatever waited beyond the tree line and the pale curve of that unfamiliar shore, it could not, in this first exhausted hour, feel like anything other than mercy. The first night on the island passed in a fog that had little to do with weather. The survivors lay where they had come ashore, too spent to build fires or seek shelter, and slept the deep, dreamless sleep of those who have exhausted every reserve the body keeps in store for terror. When morning came, filtering pale gold through a canopy of cedar they had no name for, yet many of them woke uncertain for a moment whether they had died in the night and simply not noticed the transition. The ground did not move. The air did not smell of bilge water and rot. Somewhere nearby, birds were calling to one another in a chorus that none of them recognized, and the sound of it, ordinary, unafraid, entirely unconcerned with the small drama of shipwrecked Englishmen, struck several of the company as the strangest thing they had yet witnessed. Sir George Somers was among the first to rise and walk the shoreline, if only to confirm with his own eyes what his exhausted mind was reporting. He had spent the better part of his life reading coastlines, and this one told him things that contradicted everything he had heard whispered in taverns and repeated in the margins of nautical charts. The Bermudas, the Isle of Devils, sailors called them, the place where ships went to be broken and men went to be lost. For decades, the islands had held that reputation among mariners who steered wide courses around the reefs and told stories on quieter nights, of strange cries carried on the wind and of vessels that vanished within sight of shore, swallowed by rocks that seemed almost designed by some malevolent intelligence to shred hulls and drown sailors. It was a place named for fear, avoided for fear, and never, so far as Summers knew, actually settled by anyone foolish or curious enough to stay long enough to learn its true nature. What Summers found, walking that first morning along a shore littered with the wreckage of the Sea Venture's boats and the debris of 10 months' journey, bore no resemblance to the island of report. The air was mild, softened by a breeze that carried none of the violence that had nearly killed them 3 days before. The temperature sat somewhere in the register of an English summer, generous without being oppressive, and beneath the canopy of cedar and palmetto, the light fell dappled and gentle as though the land itself had no interest in matching its reputation. Stood for a long while simply breathing it in, this contradiction between what he had been told to expect and what his senses were now insisting was true, and something in him, a tension he had carried since the storm first struck, perhaps longer, began slowly to loosen. The rest of the company discovered the same contradictions in the hours and days that followed, each in their own fashion, each finding it a little harder than the last to reconcile the island's fearsome name with its evident hospitality. William Strachey, ever the observer, walked among the cedars, taking note of what he saw with the same careful attention he had once given to the storm itself, and what he recorded was not menace, but abundance. Wild hogs moved through the underbrush in numbers that seemed to men lately rationing biscuit and prayer, almost obscene in their plenty. Descendants, most likely, of animals left by some earlier Spanish or Portuguese vessel that had touched these shores and moved on, multiplying undisturbed for years in an island. The colonists set snares within days and found the meat rich and easy to come by, a resource that would sustain them for the better part of their stay. The waters proved equally generous. Fish crowded the shallows in schools, thick enough that men waded in with nothing more sophisticated than baskets, and came out with more than they could carry, and the birds, countless numbers of them, nesting on the smaller rock outcroppings that dotted the coast, could be taken by hand in such quantities that for a time it seemed less like hunting than harvesting, less like survival than a strange and undeserved feast laid out before men who had expected only wreckage and grief. Fresh water ran in small springs and collected in natural cisterns among the rocks, clean and sufficient, a mercy that alone would have marked the island as habitable when so many other qualities conspired to make it something closer to paradise. It did not take long for the psychological weight of this discovery to settle over the company, though it settled unevenly and not without its own strange discomfort. These were men and women who had spent 3 days believing themselves dead, who had prayed themselves past terror into a kind of exhausted acceptance of drowning, and who had emerged instead onto a shore that offered not scarcity, but abundance, not danger. The mind does not pivot easily between such extremes. To Sate, several among the company reported, in the accounts that survived them, a lingering disbelief that shaded into something like suspicion, as though the island's generosity were itself a kind of trap, a lure before some deferred catastrophe, and they moved through those first weeks watching the tree line, through hard experience that mercy rarely arrived without a cost attached somewhere in its fine print. But the weeks passed, and the catastrophe did not come. The hogs did not vanish. The fish continued to crowd the shallows. The cries in the night, when they came, resolved themselves quickly enough into the calls of the Bermuda petrel, known locally in later centuries as the cahau, whose eerie nocturnal voice had almost certainly been the origin of generations of sailors' tales about devils and unquiet spirits haunting these waters. The mystery, once investigated, dissolved into something almost comic in its ordinariness, a bird, nesting in burrows along the cliffs, calling to its mate in the dark, mistaken across a century of second-hand report for the wailing of the damned. Strachey noted the resolution with something close to wry amusement, the sort of observation a man makes when he has spent weeks half expecting horror and found instead a rookery. And so gradually, the terror that had defined the company's first days on the island gave way to something none of them had anticipated, and few of them, perhaps, were fully prepared to admit, even to themselves, a reluctant, unfamiliar contentment. There is a particular species of guilt that accompanies unexpected ease after suffering, a sense that comfort has not been earned and might therefore be illegitimate. And something of this seemed to move through the company as the weeks became a month and the month showed signs of stretching further still. They had come to Virginia's aid, carrying provisions for a colony in desperate want, and here they sat instead in an abundance that colony could scarcely imagine, eating fresh pork and fish, while their intended beneficiaries, 300 miles to the northwest, continued to starve. Knowledge of this disparity did not sit easily with everyone, and it would, before long, become the seed of the company's first real conflict. For if the island was paradise, it was also, inescapably, a temptation. And temptation, among 150 English men and women thrown together by catastrophe and uncertain of their future, does not remain untested for long. The question began as a murmur, exchanged quietly between men mending nets or repairing shelters, and grew, as such things do, into something closer to open debate. Why leave at all? Why abandon a land of mild winters and generous seas, where a man might build a life with his hands and his hogs and his fish, in favor of a voyage onward to a colony known, by every report that had reached England, to be dying, starving, disease-ridden, besieged by discontent and mismanagement, a venture that had already consumed more lives than it had sustained? Virginia offered obligation, Bermuda offered ease. For some among the company, the choice did not seem difficult at all. Sir Thomas Gates, as governor-designate of Virginia, understood immediately the danger such thinking posed not merely to the colony that awaited them, but to the fragile authority he and Somers still held over a company that owed its survival at this point more to accident than to command. A charter, however solemnly worded, carries only as much weight as the willingness of desperate people to honor it, and Gates knew that the longer his company lingered in comfort, the harder that willingness would become to sustain. He began, in those early weeks, to press the case for continuing onward, gently at first, framing it as duty, as the honor of seeing through what they had sworn to do, and later with a firmer hand, as it became clear that gentleness alone would not be sufficient to hold together a company increasingly divided, who had, in the space of a few short weeks, quietly fallen in love with the island that was meant to have killed them. It was against this undercurrent of debate, half-formed, not yet a mutiny, but carrying the shape of one in its early stages, that the practical work of survival continued. Shelters rose along the shore, built from a combination of salvaged timber carried up from the wreck site and the pale, fragrant cedar that grew abundant across the island. A wood the survivors found remarkably easy to work and pleasant in ways that seemed almost designed to further undermine any urgency toward departure. Fire pits were dug. Stores of smoked meat and dried fish began to accumulate against the day, still theoretical to some and increasingly doubtful to others, when the company would resume its interrupted voyage. And beneath the cedars, in a settlement that had not existed a month before and had not been meant to exist at all, the survivors of the sea venture began, almost without meaning to build something that looked less like a waypoint and more, with each passing week, like a home. The days settled into a rhythm that none of them had planned and few would have chosen, yet which imposed itself with the quiet authority of necessity. Somers, who had spent a lifetime reading coastlines and currents, turned his attention now to the more modest cartography of survival, and under his direction and that of Gates, whose authority as governor-designate of Virginia carried at least the appearance of civil order onto an island that had never known any. The company divided itself into parties whose labors would determine whether the winter, if these latitudes could be said to know winter, would be endured in comfort or merely endured. Fishing parties went out at dawn, when the water lay flat and pewter-colored, and the fish, unaccustomed to men, could be taken by hand from the shallows or speared with sharpened staves. Others were sent inland, if the word applied to an island that a determined walker could cross in an afternoon, to search out the wild hogs that had established themselves there in years past, descendants perhaps of animals left by earlier, unrecorded visitors, or survivors of some forgotten wreck whose own castaways had not been so fortunate. The hogs, plentiful and unwary, provided meat in quantities that surprised even those who had expected the island to yield its bounty freely. Birds nested in numbers that seemed to darken the sky at dusk, and their eggs, gathered by the basketful, became a staple that no one back in Plymouth would have recognized as provision fit for gentlefolk, yet which sustained gentlefolk and sailors alike with equal indifference to rank. Shelters rose among the cedars, first crude, and then, as hands grew more practiced and the initial urgency faded into routine, increasingly substantial. Palmetto leaves, plaited and layered, kept out rain that fell in sudden tropical bursts and passed as quickly as they came. Fire pits, once dug in haste against the first cold nights, were rebuilt with greater care, lined with stone, positioned to catch what wind there was and disperse smoke away from sleeping quarters. A rough order asserted itself, not through proclamation, but through the accumulation of small habits, until the settlement had streets of a kind, paths worn by daily passage between shelter and shore, between the place where meat was smoked and the place where councils increasingly necessary were held. For it was in this same period, as bodies grew stronger and immediate hunger receded, that a different kind of hunger began to assert itself, one less easily satisfied by fish or fowl. The island, it became clear within the first weeks, offered comforts that Virginia, by every report that had reached England, did not. Here was fresh water in abundance, meat without limit, a climate that punished no one with the fevers and privations that had already claimed so many of the colonists who preceded them across the Atlantic. Why? The question began to circulate in low voices around the fire pits at night. Why trade this plenty for the uncertain misery that awaited at Jamestown, where the last news, months stale before the sea venture had ever left England, spoke of starvation and disease and graves dug faster than houses raised? Gates and Summers, whatever their private thoughts on the comforts of Bermuda, understood that their commissions, their honor, and the survival of the Virginia colony itself depended on completing the voyage they had begun. And so, even as the immediate business of feeding and sheltering the company continued, a second labor began to take shape alongside it, one that would occupy the better part of 10 months and test every skill the shipwrights among them possessed. The decision was made early, within the first weeks of their stranding, that new vessels must be built, for the Sea Venture herself, driven fast onto the reef and battered further by the tides that followed, would carry no one anywhere again. But if the hull was beyond saving, much of what she had carried was not. Her rigging, salvaged piece by piece from the wreck in the weeks after the storm, was dried and coiled and stored against future use. Her iron fittings, her bolts and nails, and the great cauldron in which pitch could be melted were recovered from the surf at considerable risk and greater patience, for the reef that had trapped her guarded its prize jealously, and more than one salvage party returned bruised and empty-handed before the work yielded results. The timber itself would come not from England, 3,000 miles and an ocean away, but from the cedars that stood in such abundance around them, trees whose wood proved, upon experiment, to be strong and workable and remarkably resistant to the rot that plagued lesser timbers in wet climates. The shipwrights among the company, men who had trained in the yards of English ports and expected to spend their careers repairing familiar vessels with familiar materials, found themselves confronting a wood that behaved differently under the adze, that seasoned at its own pace. That demanded a patience and an adaptability no apprenticeship had prepared them for. The work began in earnest as the weeks of the first months gave way to the settled routine of survival, and it proceeded with the particular slowness of labor, performed by hands that had never done such labor before, under a sun that offered little mercy to men laboring at the water's edge through the heat of the day. A framework rose first, modest in scale, for the vessel that would come to be called the Deliverance was never meant to rival the Sea Venture in size, only to carry the company, or as many of them as still intended to complete the voyage, the remaining distance to Virginia. Ribs of cedar were shaped and set. Planking, cut and fitted by trial and considerable error, was fastened to the frame with nails salvaged from the wreck, and when those ran short, with wooden pegs driven into holes bored by hand. Somers himself, despite his years, worked among the shipwrights with an energy that surprised those who had expected a man of his age to content himself with direction from a comfortable distance. He was seen often at the water's edge, examining timber, testing the set of a plank with his own hand, offering suggestions drawn from decades at sea that the younger men, for all their formal training, had never had occasion to learn. It was Somers, some accounts would later suggest, whose personal investment in the project, whose evident belief that the ships could be built and would carry them home, did more to sustain the company's flagging resolve than any order Gates might issue. For resolve did flag, and more than once as the months passed and the work proceeded with a slowness that tested even the most patient among them. The comforts of the island, so evident in the early weeks, began to work upon certain of the company in ways that boded ill for the completion of the ships. There were murmurs, and then more than murmurs, of a design among some to remain on the island permanently, to abandon Virginia and its uncertain fate altogether, and to establish here, amid the plenty of Bermuda, a settlement of their own choosing, free of the authority that Gates claimed by virtue of a commission that seemed, to men grown comfortable in a place no Englishman had ever been meant to govern, increasingly abstract and increasingly ignorable. The tensions came to a point that the survivors would speak of only reluctantly in later years, when a conspiracy, whether fully formed or merely discussed, in the loose talk of men grown restless, was uncovered and its principles confronted. Accounts differ on the particulars, as accounts of such things often do, but it is generally agreed that the matter did not resolve without violence, that at least one man died in the course of the disputes that summer, whether by formal sentence or by the more chaotic justice of a confrontation gone wrong. Whatever gentleness might have characterized his governance in easier circumstances, found it necessary to demonstrate that his authority, however strange the circumstances of its exercise, would be enforced. The island that had seemed in its first weeks a paradise without complication revealed itself in time to hold within it all the old complications of authority and appetite that men carry with them wherever they go, needing no serpent to introduce what human nature already supplies. Yet alongside these harder passages, the daily texture of life continued in its gentler register as well. Meals were shared, when circumstances allowed, in gatherings that preserved something of the old order, even in this new and improvised setting. Gentlefolk and sailors eating from the same fires, if not always the same portions, the plenty of the island making equality easier to practice than it might have been amid scarcity. Religious services were held with a regularity that many aboard found comforting. Prayers offered for deliverance in the most literal sense, psalms sung in voices that carried out over water that had so nearly claimed them all. William Strachey, whose account of these months would eventually reach England, and by paths no one on the island could have anticipated, find its way into the imagination of a playwright working in London, kept careful notes throughout, recording not only the great events of storm and wreck, but the smaller observations of a naturalist finding himself unexpectedly stranded in a place no Englishman had thought to describe before. Others kept their own letters and journals, addressed to families they could not know whether they would ever see again, folded away against the day when a ship, God willing, would carry such words home. By the time 10 months had passed since the night the Sea Venture drove onto the reef, the two vessels that would carry the company onward, the Deliverance, larger and intended for the bulk of the survivors, and the smaller Patience, built almost entirely under Somers's own close direction, stood nearly complete upon the shore where they had been raised, plank by plank, cedar by cedar, through months of labor that had asked more of untrained hands than anyone could have anticipated on that terrible night when survival itself had seemed the only conceivable ambition. Hope, quiet and unproclaimed but unmistakable now in the pace of the final work, had begun, almost in spite of the island's gentle insistence otherwise, to reassert itself. Yet before that hope could be fully claimed, before the ships could be trusted to the sea that had already taken one vessel from them, a harder matter required settling, one that had circled the camp for weeks in low voices and had at last to be spoken aloud around the fire where Gates and Somers sat with the senior men of both companies. Not every soul who had come ashore on Bermuda would leave it. 2 men at least would remain behind when the Deliverance and the Patience took to the water, and the reasons for this were as much matters of law and claim as of simple arithmetic aboard 2 small ships built to carry fewer than the number who needed carrying. The calculation of space alone might have forced some hand of selection, for the Patience was a modest vessel, and the Deliverance, though larger, had never been built with comfort in mind, only survival. And the passage to Virginia, however much shorter and gentler it was hoped to be than the crossing from England, remained a passage across open water that could not be trusted to indulge overcrowding. But it was not merely the matter of berths and provisions that settled the question of who would stay. It was the matter of Bermuda itself, and what it might become, and who might claim it, now that English feet had walked its shore for the better part of a year, and English hands had built 2 ships from its cedar, and eaten of its fish and its wild hogs, and slept beneath its stars long enough to know its seasons. Gates and Somers, men who thought in the long, patient terms of empire, even amid the wreckage of their own expedition, understood plainly enough that an island discovered, however accidentally, and inhabited, however unwillingly, was an island that might yet be claimed for England, if someone remained upon it to mark that claim with a living presence, rather than a mere report carried away and perhaps disbelieved or forgotten. Spain had claimed much of these waters already, and other nations watched the currents of the New World with their own ambitions unspoken but never absent. To leave Bermuda entirely empty, to let it stand as it had stood for centuries before their wreck, claimed and unmarked save by the bones of hogs and the timbers of a broken ship left to rot upon the reef, seemed to the 2 leaders a waste of what fortune, however cruel in its method, had nonetheless delivered into their hands. And so it was decided, with the same quiet deliberation that had governed every decision since the night of the wreck, that 2 men would remain, Christopher Carter and Edward Chard, chief among those named, are. Though the accounts differ slightly on exact numbers and on whether a third joined them for a time, to hold the island in England's name until such time as further ships might come to claim it properly, or until these same men might themselves find passage away. Whether Carter and Chard were chosen or whether they volunteered has never been settled with certainty by the records that survive. It is likely that the truth held some measure of both, that men who had grown into a particular fondness for the island, or who had grown into a particular quarrel with return, or who simply possessed less to draw them back toward Virginia and less still toward England, found themselves more readily persuaded toward remaining than others might have been, and that persuasion, gentle or otherwise, did the remaining work that pure volunteering might not have accomplished alone. There is a suggestion in some accounts that Shard had run afoul of discipline aboard the camp, had perhaps duelled or nearly duelled with another man, and that his remaining behind carried some faint flavor of exile alongside its official purpose. Though the record permits no certainty on this point, what can be said with more confidence is that neither man wept openly at the prospect of the island's solitude, and that whatever fear attended the decision was folded quietly beneath the practical business of provisioning them for a stay whose length no one could predict. They were left with what could be spared: tools, a portion of the salvaged stores, seed for planting, muskets, and shot enough to hunt the wild hogs that had sustained the whole company through the winter, and the accumulated knowledge of 10 months' survival that the departing men passed to them in final instructions delivered around the same fire where their fate had been decided. They were left too with the whole of the island's strange bounty, its cedar groves, its tide pools thick with fish, its skies undimmed by any smoke but their own, its silence broken only by the birds that had never learned to fear a human shape moving among the rocks. It was, by any honest measure, among the gentler exiles a man might be asked to endure, and there is reason to believe that Carter and Chard, whatever apprehension attended their parting from the larger company, understood this as well as anyone, that they had been left not upon a barren rock, but upon a green and living place that had fed and sheltered nearly 150 souls through the better part of a year without once betraying them to true starvation or true despair. Still, solitude is solitude, and two men upon an island, however gentle, however provisioned, faced a different order of isolation than the crowded misery of the company's early weeks had ever imposed. They would have no fire to share but their own, no other voices but each other's, no ship upon the horizon to mark the passage of days beyond the sun's own slow accounting. Whatever bond may have existed between them before the wreck, it would be tested now in ways that shared shipwreck alone had not tested it. And whatever quarrel may have divided Chard from the larger company would find no easy dissolution in a solitude that offered him only Carter's company to measure himself against, day after day, upon a shore that asked nothing of either man but that he continue living. The final preparations for departure, meanwhile, proceeded with the unhurried thoroughness that had marked every stage of the ship's construction. The Deliverance was provisioned first, her hold packed with salted meat, with casks of water drawn fresh from the island's springs, with the cedar boards and spare cordage that might yet prove useful in Virginia, where English hands, it was hoped, would find greater need of lumber than the colony's own struggling efforts had thus far supplied. The Patience took what remained, her smaller frame accepting a smaller burden, and Summers himself oversaw her loading with the same close attention he had given her building, as though the vessel that bore his particular imprint deserved a final measure of his personal care. The survivors, too, were loaded with the same careful accounting that had governed every other resource. Men and women distributed between the two vessels, according to some calculation of balance and safety that Gates and Summers had worked out between them, so that no single ship carried a fatal excess of souls should the crossing to Virginia prove less gentle than hoped. Elizabeth Persons, delivered of her child during the long months ashore, carried the infant Bermuda aboard with her, the name itself a small monument to the island that had witnessed her birth. And there were others besides who had married or been born, or simply endured together long enough that the company boarding the two ships bore little resemblance, in its accumulated intimacy, to the frightened cluster of strangers that had first crawled from the surf 10 months before. The morning of departure came at last, in early May. The exact date uncertain in the surviving accounts, but the season unmistakable. The island's mild springs settled fully upon the shore, the wild hogs thinned by the long months of hunting. The cedar groves where the ships had been built, standing now with gaps among them like missing teeth, testament to what the company had taken from the land in order to leave it. There was no grand ceremony recorded, no elaborate farewell beyond what two departing crews and two remaining men might exchange in the ordinary business of final embraces and final instructions. But there was, in the quiet of that morning, something that answered nonetheless to the shape of ceremony, a pause before the boarding. A moment in which the whole company, those leaving and those staying alike, seemed to feel the weight of what had passed between them and the island across 10 months of shared and unexpected survival. Carter and Chard stood upon the shore as the boats ferried the last of the company out to the waiting ships, and whatever words passed between them and their departing companions in that final hour have not survived to be recorded, though it is not difficult to imagine their shape. Promises of return, promises of report carried faithfully to England and to Virginia both. Perhaps some final jest to soften what could not otherwise be softened. The particular humor that men reach for when solemnity threatens to overwhelm what practical necessity requires them to simply endure. And then the boats pulled away, and the anchors were raised, and the Deliverance and the Patience turned their bows toward open water, toward Virginia, toward whatever remained of the colony they had set out 10 months before to relieve and had very nearly failed, through no fault but the sea's own indifference, to ever reach at all. The island fell away behind them slowly, as islands do, its low hills and cedar crowns diminishing by degrees, rather than vanishing all at once, so that there was time standing at the rail to watch it recede and to feel in that watching something more complicated than simple relief at departure. They had cursed this place in the first terrible days after the wreck, had called it the Isle of Devils in the tradition of sailors who had glimpsed its reefs from a wary distance and never dared approach, and yet it had fed them, sheltered them, given them the very timber from which their salvation was built, and had asked in return only the presence of 2 men to hold its shore until further claim could be made. It was difficult, watching that green shape settle into the horizon, not to feel that something had passed between the company and the island that resembled less a shipwreck's misfortune than a strange and reluctant hospitality, extended by a place with no tongue to name its own generosity and no memory to record what it had done. The 2 ships sailed on, small and alone upon the wide Atlantic, retracing in miniature the course the Sea Venture herself had never completed, carrying toward Virginia the survivors of a wreck that history would remember long after the colony they sought to save had itself passed into other chapters of the larger story. They came upon the coast of Virginia in the last days of May in the year 1610, nearly 11 months after the storm had torn them from the fleet and delivered them instead to an island no chart had shown. The Patience and the Deliverance, built by hands that had never before shaped a keel, rode low and steady on water that seemed almost gentle after what the company had endured. And those who stood at the rails watched the low green line of the Virginia shore rise slowly out of the haze with an anticipation that had been 10 months in the gathering. They had crossed an ocean twice now, in a manner of speaking, once unwillingly driven by wind into a wilderness of coral and cedar, and once again, by design, in vessels of their own making, carrying with them at last the food and the hope they had been sent to deliver. There was among the company a quiet current of pride in this arrival, a sense that some long and difficult labor was nearing its completion, that the story begun in a storm off the Azores was drawing now toward the shore where it was always meant to end. They did not yet know what waited for them at Jamestown. They could not have known. Bermuda had given them no news of the world beyond its reefs, no word of how the colony fared in their long absence, and so they sailed toward the James River with the unearned optimism of those returning from a hardship they believed had been the difficult part of the story, the trial they had already survived, after which relief and gratitude would surely follow. The river narrowed around them as they came upriver, banks thick with the same green tidewater forest that had greeted the original fleet 3 years before, and somewhere ahead, past the bends and the marshes, lay the small triangular fort where several hundred colonists had been left to establish a foothold in a new world. What they found, when the fort came into view, was silence of a kind that told its own story before a single voice could confirm it. The palisade stood, but the settlement within seemed diminished in some essential way that was difficult to name, until one drew closer and began to understand what 10 months of failed harvest and encroaching starvation had done to a population that had numbered near 500 when the Sea Ventures fleet had first departed England. Now perhaps 60 remained, and those 60 were not merely thin or weary in the way that hard labor makes men thin and weary, but hollowed, reduced to something that recalled the shape of a living body more than its substance, moving with the slow and careful economy of those who have learned that every unnecessary motion costs more than can be spared. The winter that had just passed, the colonists would come to call it the starving time, and the name would outlive every other name given to that terrible season, had emptied the storehouses, exhausted the livestock, driven men and women to eat what should never be eaten, to boil leather for its thin nourishment, to search the marsh for roots that offered more poison than sustenance. Disease had followed hunger, as it always does, and the fort's small burying ground had grown through the winter months in a manner that outpaced every other kind of growth the colony had managed. Those who survived to see the patience and the deliverance come up the river did so more through fortune than resilience, and they looked upon the newly arrived company with the dazed and disbelieving expression of people encountering rescue after having stopped expecting it. There was, in this reunion, an irony too plain to require comment, though the survivors of the wreck could not help but feel its weight settle over them as they moved among the starving colonists and understood at last what their long detour in Bermuda had spared them. They who had been cast away, who had lived for months on an island with no ships and no certainty of ever leaving it, arrived at the colony stronger, better fed, and in far better health than the men and women who had spent that same season safely, as it was supposed, within the walls of an established settlement. The island that had seemed a curse when the storm first drove them onto its reefs had provided, in its strange abundance of fish and fowl and wild hog, a sustenance that Jamestown itself had been unable to offer its own people. What? The wreck that had separated them from the fleet, that had stranded them for 10 months on an island of ill repute, had in the end fed them better than the destination they had been sailing toward. It was not a fact anyone spoke of with satisfaction. It settled instead as a quiet and sobering recognition of how thoroughly fortune had inverted itself, how the disaster had become, in retrospect, a kind of protection, and how the safe harbor had become the greater danger. The provisions the 2 small ships carried, the salted meat and hogs and turtle preserved from Bermuda, the modest stores gathered across 10 months of careful husbandry, were welcomed, but they were not enough. Sir Thomas Gates, arriving now to find himself governor of a colony that scarcely resembled the venture he had been sent to strengthen, surveyed what remained of Jamestown and concluded, along with the other leaders among the survivors, that the settlement could not be sustained. The fort's walls stood, but the fields around it lay untended. The storehouses were bare, and the number of colonists capable of labor was too small to work the ground, even if seed and season had cooperated. Whatever the Virginia Company in London had envisioned when it sent its great fleet across the Atlantic 3 years before, this, 60 starving survivors, sheltering behind a palisade in a wilderness that showed no mercy to those who could not feed themselves, was not among the outcomes they had imagined, and Gates, weighing the evidence before him, judged that the venture had reached its end, the decision was made in the first days of June to abandon Jamestown entirely. The remaining colonists, together with the survivors of the sea venture, boarded what vessels could be found, the Patience and the Deliverance among them, and prepared to sail down the James River toward the open sea, intending to make for Newfoundland, where English fishing vessels might be found to carry them home, or failing that, to England directly. However long and uncertain that voyage might prove for a company already reduced by hunger and disease. The fort was not burned by Gates's order, though some among the company argued for it better, they said, that nothing remained to mark the failure than that some future expedition find only ashes and understand at a glance what had become of the great endeavor. But Gates held that the building should stand, perhaps from some reluctance to close the door entirely, perhaps from simple practicality, and so the palisade and its structures were left standing empty as the boats moved downriver, carrying away what remained of the Virginia colony after 3 years of effort and loss. They had not gone far. The ships had barely reached the mouth of the river, moving with the tide toward the wider waters of the Chesapeake, when word came upriver that altered everything. A new fleet had arrived off the Virginia coast, sent by the Virginia Company under the command of Lord de la Warr, carrying fresh colonists, fresh provisions, and the authority of a governor empowered to see the settlement continued rather than abandoned. The timing was narrow enough to seem, in the retelling, almost providential. Had Gates's ships departed a day earlier, had the winds favored a swifter passage downriver, the colonists might have been gone before de la Warr's fleet ever came into sight, and Jamestown would have stood empty and unclaimed. Its failure recorded and its story concluded on that June morning rather than continued. But the winds had not favored haste, and so the boats turned back upriver at de la Warr's command, carrying their exhausted passengers once more toward the fort they had so recently despaired of ever seeing again, this time not to abandon it, but to receive from de la Warr's fleet the men, the food, and the resolve that would allow it to continue. Jamestown did not fail that summer, though it came near enough to failure that the margin between continuation and abandonment could be measured in a single tide, a single change of wind, a single day's delay in departure. The survivors of the sea venture, who might themselves have perished on Bermuda's reefs, who might have been lost entirely to history as one more vessel that sailed from Plymouth and was never heard from again, arrived instead at the precise moment when their provisions and their numbers, however modest, tipped a balance that had been teetering toward collapse. They had been given up for lost by the very colony they now helped preserve, and their unlikely survival, their 10 months upon an island no one expected them to leave, became in the end one of the threads that held Jamestown together long enough for de la Warr's fleet to arrive and secure its continuation. It was not a rescue accomplished with any grandeur, no single dramatic act that historians could later point to as decisive, but rather a quiet convergence of near misses and narrow timings. The kind of history that turns not on great deeds, but on the accident of a boat not yet having cleared a river's mouth. The colony that would in time become the enduring seed of English settlement in America had come in that June of 1610, closer to its end than most who later told its story cared to dwell upon. And it was saved in part by the survivors of a wreck the world believed it had already lost. And yet, the world had not simply forgotten the sea venture. It had assumed her dead, and in the assuming had already begun to grieve her, and in the grieving had unknowingly prepared the ground for a story that would outlast every ship's timber and every colonist's grave. For while the survivors labored through their 10 months on Bermuda, and while the 2 ships they built carried them onward to Jamestown, and while the colony teetered and steadied and teetered again, the news of what had happened to the sea venture had not yet reached England at all. As far as London knew, the flagship of the third supply had simply vanished into the Atlantic, one more vessel swallowed by a sea that kept no accounts and offered no explanations. The Virginia Company had absorbed the loss as companies of the age absorbed such things. with prayers, with revised ledgers, with a certain grim recalculation of investment against risk, and had gone on, as ventures must, to speak of the colony's future without her. It was not until the late summer and early autumn of 1610, when other ships crossed the ocean bearing letters from Jamestown, that the truth began to surface in England, and it surfaced not as a single announcement, but as a slow accumulation of pages, passed from hand to hand, copied and recopied. Read aloud in rooms lit by tallow candles long after the ink upon them had already dried an ocean away. Among these pages were two accounts that would matter more than their authors could have possibly foreseen. One, a private letter written by a man named William Strachey to an unnamed lady of quality, and the other, a published pamphlet by a fellow survivor named Sylvester Jourdan, printed and sold in London stalls within the year. Strachey's letter was the longer and the more literary of the two, a document that read less like a mariner's log and more like a work of considered prose, full of the particular cadences of a man who had studied language and meant to be remembered for his handling of it. He had been aboard the Sea Venture through every hour of her ordeal, had watched the storm come on with its low, moaning grey light, had felt the ship's seams open beneath his feet, had bailed alongside common sailors and gentlemen alike in that long fellowship of fear that erases for a time all the careful distinctions of rank. He wrote of the wind as a thing almost sentient in its cruelty, of the sea rising in walls that seemed to blot out the sky itself, of the ship's master calling out soundings that made no sense until the truth of them settled that they were not sinking in open ocean, but running, by some mercy neither he nor anyone aboard could explain, toward land where no charts had ever recorded land to be. He wrote, too, of the island itself, of Bermuda's strange abundance after the terror of the wreck of hogs multiplying in wild profusion, of birds so unafraid of men that they could be taken by hand, of a place that seemed, in the peculiar logic of survival, almost designed to receive them. And he wrote of the darker undercurrents that ran beneath that survival, the whispered plots, the executions, the long fraying of order among men who had expected a swift crossing and found themselves marooned instead, in a purgatory of surprising comfort and slow-building dread. It was, in every particular, an extraordinary document, and though it was addressed to a single reader, it did not remain private for long. Copies began to circulate, first among Strachey's own acquaintances, then more widely drawn by the sheer rarity of what it described. A ship lost, a company presumed drowned. And then, astonishingly alive, not merely alive, but thriving, having built new vessels from the wreck of the old and sailed on to complete, however belatedly, the voyage that storm had interrupted. Jourdan's account, published as a modest pamphlet under the title A Discovery of the Bermudas, otherwise called the Isle of Devils, moved more quickly into public circulation than Strachey's letter, precisely because it was printed, precisely because it did not require the intimacy of private correspondence to reach a reader's hands. It could be bought. It could be read aloud in taverns and coffee houses, passed from one curious Londoner to the next, its slim pages carrying the same essential wonder as Strachey's longer account, but compressed into a form suited to swift and eager consumption. Where Strachey lingered, Jourdan moved briskly, but the substance beneath both accounts was the same. A ship given up for lost, an island whose very name conjured superstition and dread among mariners who had long spoken of Bermuda as a place to be avoided, haunted by tempests and by some accounts by devils themselves. And into that haunted place had come a company of English men and women who found not devils, but abundance, not death, but an unlikely reprieve. It is difficult now, at this distance, to fully recover the particular texture of the fascination these accounts produced in London, but something of it can be reconstructed from what we know of the city's appetite for news of the New World in that period, an appetite already primed by years of pamphlets and sermons and investor prospectuses extolling Virginia's promise, and now presented with a story that exceeded anything the promotional literature had dared to invent. Here was no mere tale of hardship endured and profit eventually realized. The standard narrative arc the Virginia Company preferred its supporters to absorb. Here was something closer to resurrection, a ship raised, in effect, from among the dead. Its company delivered not through some triumph of navigation or seamanship, but through what many readers could only describe as providence, a word that recurs again and again in the writings of the period. Applied to the sea venture's survival with an insistence that suggests genuine, unfeigned astonishment. London in those years was a city of playhouses as much as pulpits, and the same restless curiosity that filled sermons with talk of providence filled theatres with talk of wonder, and the accounts of the Bermuda wreck moved easily between these two worlds, discussed by clergymen and playwrights alike, though for somewhat different purposes. Among those who read Strachey's letter, and the evidence for this, though circumstantial, is compelling enough that most historians have come to accept it, was a playwright then at the height of his powers. A man whose company performed regularly at court and whose patrons included precisely the sort of gentlemen adventurers who held shares in the Virginia Company, and who would have had early and privileged access to news from Jamestown. William Shakespeare moved in circles that intersected directly and repeatedly with the circles through which Strachey's letter passed. The connections are not merely plausible but well documented. Men who backed the Virginia Company sat on the boards of the same theatrical enterprises that employed Shakespeare, and the flow of information in early Jacobean London, though it lacked the machinery of a modern press, was neither slow nor narrow among men of means and curiosity. By the time Shakespeare came to compose what would become his late romance, The Tempest, likely in the year following the wreck's news reaching London, the parallels between the play and the Bermuda accounts were close enough that later scholars would spend centuries tracing them, line by line, detail by detail. Building a case that has never achieved perfect certainty, but has achieved something close to consensus. The play opens, after all, with a storm at sea so vividly rendered that it reads less like stage convention and more like eyewitness memory translated into verse. A ship battered by wind and wave, its passengers convinced of their own drowning, cast finally upon an island whose nature seems to shift with every scene, sometimes a paradise, sometimes a place of menace, inhabited by a spirit of the air and a creature of the earth, who together suggest the strange double nature that Strachey and Jourdain had, both in their different registers, ascribed to Bermuda itself. The echoes extend further than atmosphere alone. The Tempest's plot turns on political intrigue among the shipwrecked party, plots against the rightful ruler, whispered conspiracies among men who believe themselves beyond the reach of law now that the sea has delivered them to an island where old hierarchies seem, for a moment, negotiable. This mirrors, with an exactness that has struck generations of scholars, the accounts of unrest among the Sea Venture survivors on Bermuda, the conspiracies against Gates, the executions carried out to restore order. The sense running through Strachey's letter that authority itself had become a fragile and contested thing once removed from the institutions that normally sustained it. Even smaller details align with a precision that resists easy dismissal as coincidence. Ariel's description of St. Elmo's fire dancing along the ship's rigging during the storm corresponds closely to a passage in Strachey's letter describing exactly such a phenomenon, a detail specific enough and rare enough in the literature of the period. That its appearance in both texts has long been treated as among the strongest evidences of direct influence. None of this is to suggest that Shakespeare simply transcribed the Bermuda accounts into dramatic verse, for The Tempest is, in every essential way, its own invention. a meditation on power and forgiveness, on the uses and abuses of magic, on the strange tenderness that can survive even betrayal. Themes that owe more to Shakespeare's own preoccupations across his late plays than to any single source. But the raw material of the wreck, the texture of the storm, the peculiar liminal quality of an island that could be paradise or prison, depending on who described it, these the playwright seems to have drawn, whether consciously borrowed or simply absorbed through the atmosphere of a London newly electrified by the story. From the very same letters and pamphlets that had carried the Sea Venture's survival across the ocean. There is a quiet irony worth sitting with here, one that the survivors themselves, occupied as they were with the more immediate business of keeping a fragile colony alive, could scarcely have appreciated. The Sea Venture had been dispatched, at considerable expense and with considerable hope, to resupply a struggling settlement clinging to survival on the edge of an unmapped continent, a mission of provisions and reinforcement, of nails and salt pork and fresh colonists to replace the dead. That mission had very nearly failed entirely, the ship driven from her course, wrecked upon an island she was never meant to see, her cargo scattered and her passengers marooned for the better part of a year. And yet from that failure, from that wreck, the world had already mourned as a total loss, came something the Virginia Company's investors had never budgeted for and could never have purchased outright. An accidental gift to English letters, delivered not to Jamestown but to a playhouse in London, where a shipwreck meant only to save a colony would go on. Instead, to help immortalize a playwright, and through him, in some measure, to immortalize the wreck itself. The centuries that followed asked little of the wreck itself. The Sea Venture had done her work in memory long before anyone thought to look for her. In fact, Shakespeare's storm played on to new audiences, translated into languages the sailors who lived through the actual Tempest would never have heard, while the ship that gave the story its bones settled quietly into the reef where William Strachey had once watched her timbers give way. Bermuda grew around her absence. Villages rose along the shoreline. Forts were built to guard channels that had once been navigated only by instinct and prayer, and the wreck itself passed from event to legend to half-remembered footnote, the kind of thing older residents might mention to visitors. The reef that had saved 150 lives kept its secret well. Coral does not preserve memory the way parchment does. It grows over what it is given, sealing wood and iron alike beneath centuries of accumulated life, until a wreck ceases to look like a ship at all and becomes instead a shape in the coral, a discoloration, a place where fish gather for reasons no one troubles to ask. It was not until the 20th century that anyone began asking those questions in earnest. Bermuda's waters had by then already given up other wrecks, later ships, better documented, easier to identify by cargo or by names stamped into surviving metal. But the Sea Venture occupied a peculiar status among historians and treasure hunters. Alike, everyone knew in the broad outline where she must have gone down. Strachey's account was specific enough about the reef, about the direction of the wind, about the desperate maneuvering that had driven her onto the rocks rather than let her break apart in open water. And yet, specificity in a 400-year-old letter is not the same as a location on a chart. Reefs shift their apparent boundaries with tides and centuries. Landmarks Strachey might have used to fix the wreck's position, a particular promontory, a stretch of coastline, had changed names, changed shapes, in some cases changed entirely as storms rearranged the low limestone islands the way they had always done. Anyone searching for the wreck was searching not for a fixed point, but for a story that had to be reverse-engineered from prose written by a frightened man 3 days after the worst night of his life. It fell, eventually, to a small number of persistent searchers working through the middle decades of the 20th century, and to the diving technology that made prolonged underwater investigation practical for the first time. Bermuda's waters are clear and shallow along much of its reef line, a fact that had doomed countless ships over the centuries by making the coral look deceptively close to safe passage, and that same clarity now worked in favor of those hoping to find what those wrecks had left behind. Divers moved slowly along suspected stretches of reef, following patterns of debris, anomalies in the coral growth, the telltale ballast stones that settle where wooden hulls have rotted away and left only their heaviest cargo behind. Ballast stones do not decay. They sit where gravity and current leave them, sometimes for centuries, marking a wreck's grave long after every plank has dissolved into the sea's slow chemistry. In 1958, after years of searching informed by Strachey's narrative and by local knowledge of the reef's treacherous character, a wreck was located that matched, with growing confidence, the profile of an early 17th century vessel. It lay in relatively shallow water off the eastern end of the islands, its timbers mostly gone, its outlines suggested more by the pattern of ballast and scattered artifacts than by any recognizable ship's shape. This was not, initially, a dramatic discovery in the way popular imagination might picture a shipwreck's finding: no towering hull looming out of the dark, no captain's cabin intact and waiting. It was a scatter, a field of stones and iron, and the slow accretion of coral over 400 years, requiring patient reading rather than sudden recognition. And yet, as archaeologists began the careful, unglamorous work of confirming what they had found, the details accumulated towards certainty. The ballast stones were of a type and size consistent with English shipbuilding of the period. Iron fittings recovered from the site, bolts, spikes, fragments of rigging hardware matched patterns known from other vessels of the early 1600 seconds. And crucially, the location matched, as closely as 4 centuries of shifting coastline allowed, the reef Strachey had described, the one where Summers had steered his failing ship with such desperate precision that not a single life had been lost in the wrecking itself. The identification would take years to solidify into scholarly consensus, and further excavation throughout the following decades would add confidence rather than certainty. The nature of underwater archaeology being one of probability built from accumulated evidence. But by the time serious archaeological work began in earnest, most historians working on early Bermuda and early Virginia were prepared to accept that the wreck off that stretch of reef was, in fact, what remained of the sea venture. The flagship that had carried Sir Thomas Gates and Sir George Somers and William Strachey and some 150 others into a storm meant to end their colonial ambitions, and had instead delivered them by accident into the strange safety of an uninhabited island. The excavation itself proceeded with the patience the wreck demanded. Marine archaeology does not move quickly and should not. Every timber lifted from the seabed, every artifact freed from 4 centuries of coral encrustation represents a small, irreversible act, and the archaeologists who worked the site over subsequent seasons treated it with the caution such irreversibility requires. Divers mapped the wreck field, meter by meter, recording the position of every recoverable object before it was moved, building a picture not merely of what the ship had carried, but of how it had come to rest. The pattern of scattering telling its own story of the impact, the grounding, the slow disintegration that followed over years and then centuries. Timbers that had survived, protected by the sand and coral that entombed them, even as those same forces destroyed the wreck's more exposed sections, were recovered and conserved through slow, careful processes designed to stabilize wood that had spent 400 years saturated with seawater and would disintegrate rapidly if allowed to dry improperly. Iron artifacts, encrusted almost beyond recognition in concretions of coral and rust, were X-rayed before cleaning so that archaeologists might know what lay beneath the accretion before risking the delicate work of exposing it. What emerged, piece by piece, was a portrait of a specific ship, and, through her, of the world that had built her. The Sea Venture, examined through her scattered remains, showed the construction methods typical of English merchant vessels of her era. A hull built for capacity and endurance rather than speed, designed for the kind of long transatlantic voyage that demanded resilience above all else. Fragments of the ship's structure revealed details about framing techniques, about the joinery methods English shipwrights favored in the years just before more standardized naval architecture practices took hold. Ceramic fragments recovered from the site, pieces of everyday shipboard crockery, storage vessels for provisions, some fine enough to suggest they belonged to the ship's more prominent passengers, offered glimpses of daily life, aboard of the small comforts and habits people carried with them. A few personal items, remarkably preserved by the same coral that had otherwise destroyed so much, hinted at the individuals who had once walked the ship's deck, though the sea gives up identity far less readily than it gives up objects, and none of the artifacts could be traced to specific named passengers with any certainty. Historians and archaeologists who worked on or studied the site in the years following its excavation spoke of the wreck's significance in terms that extended well beyond its connection to Shakespeare, though that connection inevitably shaped much of the public interest the discovery generated. For scholars of early English colonization, the Sea Venture wreck offered a rare physical anchor for a story otherwise known only through documents, a way of confirming, through the tangible evidence of timber and iron and ballast stone, that the extraordinary events Strachey and others had described, verifiable catastrophe survived by actual, identifiable people. For maritime historians, the wreck added meaningfully to the sparse archaeological record of early 17th century English shipbuilding, a period from which few vessels survive in any form, wrecked or otherwise. One archaeologist involved in the years of study that followed the initial identification would later write that the Sea Venture occupied an almost unique position among historical wrecks, not merely old, not merely significant to a single nation's colonial history, but tied by unbroken thread to one of the most celebrated works of English literature. A wreck whose accidental legacy had shaped culture long before its physical remains were ever recovered from the sea that swallowed them. Today, the artifacts recovered from that reef rest in museum collections, most prominently in Bermuda itself, where visitors can stand before glass cases holding ceramic shards, iron fittings, ballast stones worn smooth by 4 centuries of tide, and the occasional more evocative fragment, a buckle, a fastener, a piece of rigging hardware, whose specific use has long since become a matter of scholarly reconstruction rather than certain knowledge. The objects are modest, most of them unglamorous in the way that honest archaeological evidence usually is, offering none of the golden hoards. Popular imagination sometimes expects from shipwrecks, but their modesty is, in its own way, part of what makes them valuable. They are the actual residue of an actual voyage, unfiltered by literary embellishment, untouched by 400 years of retelling. They do not perform the storm the way Strachey's prose performs it, or the way Shakespeare's verse performs it once removed. They simply are what remains, quiet, encrusted, patiently recovered witnesses. To the 3 days of water and the 10 months of exile that followed, sitting now behind glass, in the quiet of museum rooms, asking nothing of those who pass, what they represent in the end is the strange and patient way the consequence unfolds across centuries, how a single event, violent and brief, can send its effects rippling outward through so many different channels that the people living through it could never have traced the shape of what they were setting in motion. The hurricane that struck the Sea Venture in July of 1609 lasted perhaps 3 days. Measured against the whole of human history, against the slow turning of centuries that separate that storm from this quiet telling of it, 3 days is nothing. A breath, a flicker, gone almost as soon as it is noticed. And yet those 3 days reached forward through time in ways that no one aboard the ship could have imagined, as they bailed water in the dark and prayed against the working of the seams. They could not have known that the very storm threatening to kill them would in its aftermath become the reason a struggling colony, an ocean away, did not simply vanish from the historical record the way so many other early ventures had vanished before it. Jamestown, in the spring of 1610, was a settlement reduced nearly to its last breath. Sigus. The winter that had passed was later remembered as the starving time, a phrase that carries within it the plain horror of what those months had actually been. A period of hunger so severe that the settlers had eaten what could not properly be called food, had watched their numbers fall from several hundred to a bare remnant, had reached the point where abandonment seemed not merely reasonable but necessary, the only sane response to a situation that had become unsurvivable. When Gates and the survivors of the sea venture finally arrived that May, having built their own vessels from Bermuda cedar and sailed the last leg of a voyage begun nearly a year earlier, they found not a thriving settlement grateful for reinforcement, but a colony already abandoning itself, already loading what remained onto ships and preparing to sail away from Virginia entirely, to let the whole venture collapse into memory the way so many similar ventures had collapsed before. The timing here is worth sitting with, because it is the kind of timing that historians are professionally suspicious of, the kind of narrative convenience that would be dismissed as too tidy if it appeared in fiction rather than in a documented sequence of events. The sea venture survivors arrived at the precise moment when their arrival could still matter, when the colonists had begun their withdrawal but had not yet cleared the river, when a decision could still be reversed rather than merely mourned. Had the wreck occurred a season later, had the building of the pinnaces in Bermuda taken another few months, had any of the countless small variables that shape a sea voyage tilted differently, the ships might have arrived to find Jamestown empty, the settlers already gone, the whole venture already ended. Instead, they arrived in time to turn the retreating colonists back, to combine what supplies remained with what little the sea venture party had managed to preserve, and to hold the settlement together through the arrival, shortly after, of Lord de la Warr with fresh provisions and fresh colonists from England. The consequence of that narrow margin of timing is not a small thing. Virginia held. The colony that had nearly emptied itself in that starving spring became, over the following years, the anchor of English settlement in North America, the beginning of a colonial project that would eventually reshape the continent entirely. It is not too much to say that the storm which nearly killed George Somers and his 400 fellow travelers was also, through the strange arithmetic of consequence, the storm that kept Jamestown from becoming merely another failed venture, another name in the long list of English attempts at American settlement. The delay itself, the 10 months spent in Bermuda, rather than the 2 or 3 weeks the voyage should have taken, turned out to matter as much as anything the survivors carried with them when they finally arrived. Without those months, the settlers might have reached Virginia in time to strengthen a colony that was still merely struggling rather than already dying. With them, they arrived instead at the exact threshold of collapse, in time to prevent it, but only just. There is a temptation telling this story to speak of fate or providence, to frame the whole sequence as though some guiding hand had arranged the storm and the wreck and the timing of the rescue as a single deliberate design. The people of the period certainly spoke in those terms. Strucky's letter is full of the language of divine mercy, and the sermons preached in London in the aftermath of the news drew heavily on the same vocabulary. The storm as trial, the survival as grace, the whole episode as evidence of a providence watching over the English colonial project even in its darkest moments. It would be simpler, and perhaps more honest, to leave the theological framing to the people who lived through the events and held those beliefs sincerely, and to observe instead, from the distance of 4 centuries, only the plain fact of the consequence without needing to explain its cause. A storm struck a ship. The ship did not sink. The delay it caused, rather than destroying a colony, preserved it. The people who survived the wreck went on to build things, some literal in the timbers and coral and cedar of Bermuda's earliest permanent settlement, some literary in the words that Strachey's account eventually inspired an ocean away in the mind of a playwright who never crossed the Atlantic himself. Because the Sea Venture's second legacy, running parallel to the survival of Jamestown, is the survival of a story. The strange fact that a private letter, written by a company secretary, describing a hurricane and a wreck and 10 months on an uninhabited island, found its way into circulation in London, whether directly or through the network of overlapping accounts that surrounded it, planted itself in the imagination of William Shakespeare closely enough that the storm which opens the Tempest carries unmistakable traces of the storm that struck the Sea Venture, and the enchanted island where Prospero has made his exile carries traces too. Click. Bermuda's uncanny reputation, its cries of spirits, its Isle of Devils, transformed by the play into something closer to a place of strange magic and eventual reconciliation. Whether Shakespeare read Strachey directly or absorbed the story through the wider conversation it generated in London, hardly changes the deeper point, which is that a real hurricane, a real wreck, a real 10 months of exile on a real island, became within a handful of years raw material for one of the most enduring works of English literature. A play still performed on stages around the world 4 centuries after Somers first sighted the reef through the wreck's shattered timbers. This is the chain of consequence, worth pausing on. A hurricane that should have killed several hundred people instead delayed them long enough to save a colony, and the account of their survival, written down by one of their own number, crossed the ocean and entered the bloodstream of English literature. So that the storm exists now not only as a historical event documented in company records and personal letters, but as an ongoing presence in culture, performed and read and studied long after every person who lived through the actual wreck has been gone for centuries. The timbers recovered from the reef, resting now in their museum cases, are connected by an unbroken thread to Miranda's wonder at the strange new world and Prospero's stage Tempest, and Caliban's claim upon the island that was his before it was anyone else's. The wreck is the seed from which both a surviving colony and an enduring play eventually grew. 2 very different kinds of survival, both traceable back to the same 3 days of water and wind in July of 1609. And beneath all of this, beneath the colonial history and the literary legacy and the centuries of retelling, the physical fact of the wreck itself remains settled into its reef off the eastern point of Bermuda, timbers long since surrendered to coral and sand, ballast stones scattered across the seabed where they came to rest. The whole site quiet now, beneath water that moves gently over it with the tide, indifferent to everything the wreck set in motion. Divers still visit the site, or the water there is clear, warm, unhurried, moving over the old timbers the way it has moved over them for 400 years, asking nothing of what lies beneath, offering no explanation, simply continuing as the sea continues, patient and untroubled by the enormous weight of consequence that a single storm once set loose upon the world. It is a strange kind of monument, a reef where a ship once broke apart, without inscription, without ceremony, marked only by the quiet accumulation of coral over old wood. And yet it holds within it the beginning of a colony that held, a play that endures, and a story that has now traveled far enough to reach this telling of it. Dark carried across centuries, the way the survivors were once carried across an ocean they never intended to cross in the way they finally did. The water above the reef is calm tonight, as it has been calm on so many nights before, moving gently over what the storm left behind, asking for nothing, offering only the plain continuation of the sea. If you have found some rest in this telling of the sea venture and the storm that shaped it, you are welcome to stay a while longer among the other lost voyages gathered here. Quiet histories of ships and storms and the long, patient work of the sea.